Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The Bell spaceship paradox. When two rockets pull a string apart, two identical spaceships float in space, separated by some distance, let us say 1 kilometer measured in their initial rest frame, and a thin thread connects the two ships, stretched taut but not under tension, and now both ships fire their rockets simultaneously, both accelerating at exactly the same rate, both reaching the same velocity at the same time as measured in the original rest frame. And the question arises, what happens to the thread? Does it break or does it remain intact? And the paradox is that two different lines of reasoning seem to give opposite answers. One argument says the thread remains intact because both ships accelerate identically and maintain constant separation in the original rest frame, while another argument says the thread must break because of length contraction, and this is Bell's spaceship paradox, proposed by physicist John Stuart Bell to clarify misconceptions about special relativity and the nature of length contraction. Consider the first argument. In the original rest frame, both ships start 1 kilometer apart, and both ships accelerate at the same rate, their velocities remaining equal at all times, and so the distance between them, as measured in the original rest frame, remains 1 kilometer throughout the acceleration. The ships maintain constant separation as measured by rulers at rest in the original frame, and the thread, stretched between the ships, also spans 1 kilometer in this frame. And if the separation does not change, then why would the thread break? It experiences no increased tension, no stretching, and so the thread should remain intact. And this reasoning seems compelling, seems to follow directly from the symmetry of the situation. But now consider the second argument. From the perspective of someone accelerating with the ships, someone in the instantaneous rest frame of the spaceships at any given moment, and in this frame, the distance between the ships is undergoing length contraction relative to the original frame. The proper distance between the ships, the distance measured by a ruler moving with the ships, is greater than 1 kilometer and growing, because the ships are maintaining constant coordinate separation in the original frame, while length contraction says that moving objects are contracted. And so to maintain constant coordinate separation in the original frame, the proper separation must increase, must stretch. And the thread, a physical object with a rest length, cannot stretch indefinitely without breaking. And so the thread must snap as the proper distance between the ships increases beyond the thread's breaking point. Bell's answer, and the correct answer according to relativity, is that the thread breaks. The second argument is correct, and the error in the first argument is subtle. It confuses coordinate distance in the original rest frame with proper distance measured by moving rulers. And length contraction does not mean that objects physically shrink in their own rest frame. It means that the relationship between coordinate distance in one frame and proper distance in another frame involves a contraction factor. And when two ships maintain constant coordinate separation in the original frame while accelerating, they are actually increasing their proper separation, the distance measured by rulers that move with them. And the thread, stretched between the ships, experiences this increasing proper separation as tension, and eventually the tension exceeds the thread's strength and it breaks. Imagine the situation more concretely. Place a series of markers at rest in the original frame, spaced 1 meter apart, stretching from the first ship to the second ship. And initially, there are 1,000 markers spanning the 1 kilometer between the ships. And now, the ships accelerate, and at any given instant in the original frame, the ships remain at the same markers they started at. The distance between them measured by these markers remains 1,000 meters, but from the perspective of the moving ships, the markers are getting closer together, are contracting because the markers are in motion relative to the ships, and so the ships see more and more markers passing between them. The number of markers spanning the gap increases, and this means the proper distance between the ships is increasing, and the thread, which has a fixed rest length, cannot span this increasing proper distance, and it breaks. The paradox reveals a common misconception about special relativity, the idea that if two objects start with a certain separation and undergo identical accelerations, then they must maintain the same separation. But this is false. Maintaining the same coordinate separation in one frame requires increasing proper separation when the objects are accelerating. And this is because acceleration is not relative in the way velocity is. Accelerating objects experience forces, have proper accelerations that can be measured by accelerometers on board, and two spaceships with identical proper accelerations do not maintain constant proper separation. They drift apart in their own instantaneous rest frames. Bell used this paradox to clarify that length contraction is a real physical effect, not merely a coordinate artifact or an optical illusion. The thread really breaks. Real physical forces are involved, and the contraction of moving objects is a consequence of how electromagnetic forces between atoms transform under Lorentz boosts. And these forces are what hold matter together, what give objects their rigidity, and when objects accelerate, the forces adjust. And in the Bell spaceship scenario, the adjustment causes the thread to experience tension and eventually to snap. The paradox also connects to the Ehrenfest paradox, another puzzle in special relativity involving rotation and length contraction, where a disk spinning at relativistic speeds seems to have a contracted circumference but unchanged radius, leading to apparent contradictions with Euclidean geometry. And both paradoxes illustrate that accelerated motion introduces subtleties that are not present in inertial motion, that naive applications of length contraction can lead to errors, and that careful analysis using the full machinery of special relativity is required to get the right answers. Visualize the two spaceships accelerating in lockstep, their separation constant as measured by observers at rest, but the thread between them stretching from the ship's perspective, growing taut, fibers straining and eventually snapping, breaking in the middle, the two halves trailing behind each ship, and the observers at rest see the thread break. Even though the ships never change their coordinate separation, and this breaking is real, is frame independent, all observers agree that the thread broke. Though they may disagree about why, about what forces were involved, but the physical fact of the breaking is invariant, is an event in spacetime that everyone can observe. Bell's spaceship paradox remains a challenging problem in relativity pedagogy. Many students, and even some physicists, initially get it wrong, arguing that the thread should not break. And the paradox serves as a test of whether someone truly understands length contraction and the relativity of simultaneity, whether they can correctly apply these concepts to accelerating objects. And the paradox has generated extensive discussion in physics journals, with papers clarifying the resolution and exploring variations. And it stands as a reminder that special relativity, despite being over a century old, still contains subtleties that require careful thought, that intuitions about space and time must be constantly checked against the formalism, and that even seemingly simple scenarios can hide deep complexities. The rockets fire, the ships accelerate, maintaining constant spacing in the original frame, and the thread stretches, taut and straining, and then snaps, unable to bridge the growing proper distance. And Bell's paradox resolves, the thread breaks, relativity vindicated, and the lesson learned, that acceleration changes things, that maintaining coordinate separation requires increasing proper separation, that length contraction is real and physical, and that relativity continues to surprise, continues to challenge intuition, continues to reward careful analysis with deeper understanding of how space and time and motion interweave to create the strange but consistent fabric of relativistic physics. The barber paradox. In a small village, there lives a barber who follows a single rule. He shaves all and only those men in the village who do not shave themselves. And this rule seems simple enough until the question emerges: does the barber shave himself? And suddenly the logic collapses into contradiction. If the barber shaves himself, then he belongs to the group of men who shave themselves, which means according to the rule, he should not shave himself because he only shaves men who do not shave themselves. But if he does not shave himself, then he belongs to the group of men who do not shave themselves, which means according to the rule, he must shave himself because he shaves all men who do not shave themselves, and the loop tightens without escape, spinning endlessly between two impossible options. Bertrand Russell popularized this version of his own paradox as a way to make the abstract problem of self-referential sets more accessible, more human, more vivid, because a barber is easier to imagine than a set of all sets that do not contain themselves. Yet the logical structure remains identical, a rule that turns inward and devours its own coherence. The paradox reveals something unsettling about definitions and categories, that not all rules can be consistently applied, that language and logic can conspire to create situations that seem perfectly reasonable until examined closely, and then they shatter. Some philosophers argue that the barber simply cannot exist, that the rule itself is contradictory, and therefore no such barber could ever follow it in reality, while others suggest that the problem lies in assuming the rule must apply universally, that perhaps the barber is exempt from his own rule, or that the village contains no barber at all. The paradox also exposes the danger of self-reference, the way that statements or rules that loop back on themselves can generate infinite regress or outright contradiction. And this has implications far beyond barbershops, touching mathematics, computer science, law, and any system that attempts to regulate itself from within. In set theory, the barber paradox mirrors Russell's discovery that naive set theory permits the construction of sets that cannot exist without contradiction, forcing mathematicians to impose restrictions on which sets are allowed to form, creating hierarchies and boundaries to prevent self-reference from poisoning the system. The barber stands at the edge of reason, a figure trapped in a loop of his own making, unable to shave or not shave without violating the very rule that defines his existence, and in this way, he becomes a symbol of the limits of logic, a reminder that not every question has an answer, that some problems resist resolution no matter how carefully they are examined. The paradox lingers in the mind, a simple story about a man and a razor that somehow reveals a crack in the foundation of thought itself, and once noticed, it cannot be ignored, appearing again and again wherever rules turn inward, wherever systems attempt to contain themselves, wherever language reaches the boundary of what it can coherently express. The bootstrap paradox. There exists a strange loop in time where cause and effect chase each other in a circle, where information or objects appear from nowhere, with no origin, no creator, no beginning, and this is the bootstrap paradox, named after the impossible act of pulling oneself up by one's own bootstraps, a paradox that emerges whenever time travel creates a causal loop that has no starting point. Imagine a time traveler who loves a particular symphony, and one day they decide to travel back in time to meet the composer, but when they arrive in the past, they discover that the composer has not yet written the symphony, and so the time traveler, eager to hear the music again, writes down the notes from memory and gives them to the composer, who then publishes it as their own work, and the symphony becomes famous, and years later the time traveler hears it and falls in love with it and decides to travel back in time to meet the composer, and the loop is complete. The question that haunts this scenario is simple and unanswerable. Who actually composed the symphony? The composer received it from the time traveler, and the time traveler received it from the composer, and neither of them created it. the information, simply exists within the loop, passed from future to past and back again, with no point of origin, no moment of creation, no author. The bootstrap paradox differs from the grandfather paradox because it does not involve contradiction. The timeline is perfectly self-consistent. Every event follows logically from every other event. There is no clash between cause and effect, and yet something feels deeply wrong, an intuition that things must come from somewhere. That information cannot simply exist without being created. The paradox appears in many variations: a book that writes itself, a watch that is given to a younger version of oneself, who then keeps it for decades before giving it back, a technology that is brought from the future and used to invent itself, and in each case the object or information becomes eternal, trapped in a loop of time, aging perhaps, but never truly beginning or ending. Some physicists accept the bootstrap paradox as a genuine possibility if time travel is real, arguing that closed time-like curves, paths through space-time that loop back on themselves, are permitted by general relativity under certain conditions, and that such loops might allow for causally self-sufficient systems where the past and future are mutually dependent. Others find the paradox deeply troubling, a sign that something is wrong with our understanding of causation, entropy, or time itself, because information in a loop would violate the second law of thermodynamics, which states that entropy always increases, that order does not arise spontaneously from disorder, and yet in a bootstrap loop, the information appears to be perfectly preserved, never degrading, never increasing in entropy, existing in a kind of timeless stasis. The many worlds interpretation offers one way out, suggesting that the time traveler who delivers the symphony creates a new branch of reality, and that in their original timeline, the symphony had a different origin, but this solution feels like cheating, multiplying universes to avoid the discomfort of the loop. The bootstrap paradox forces confrontation with deep questions about the nature of causation, whether causes must always precede effects, whether the universe permits closed causal loops, and whether existence itself requires an ultimate origin, or whether some things can simply be eternal and self-caused, through time without beginning or end, defying the intuition that everything must come from something, that there must always be a first cause, a prime mover, a starting point from which all else flows. The blind sight paradox: why some blind people can see without seeing. A patient suffers damage to the primary visual cortex, the region of the brain that processes visual information and produces conscious visual experience, and the damage is severe, destroys the tissue completely, and the patient reports being blind, reports seeing nothing, experiencing only darkness in the affected visual field, and vision tests confirm the blindness. The patient cannot identify objects placed in the blind region, cannot read letters, cannot describe colours or shapes, and by every standard clinical measure, the patient has lost vision in that part of their visual field. And yet something strange occurs. Experimenters place objects in the blind field and ask the patient to guess where they are, to point at them even though the patient cannot see them, and the patient protests, says this is pointless, says there is nothing to see, but when forced to guess, the patient points accurately, reaches correctly, identifies the location, and sometimes even the nature of objects at levels far above chance. And this ability, this capacity to respond to visual information without conscious visual experience is called blind sight, and it creates a paradox. The patient is both blind and not blind, both lacks vision and has vision, lacks conscious sight but retains unconscious visual processing. And this dissociation between conscious experience and information processing challenges our understanding of perception, challenges the relationship between consciousness and function, and raises questions about what vision is, whether seeing requires awareness, whether perception requires experience. And this is the blind sight paradox, a phenomenon that reveals that consciousness can be separated from processing, that the brain can use information without the person experiencing it. Imagine the blind sight patient's perspective, looking straight ahead, and part of the visual field is normal, contains conscious visual experience, objects and colours and shapes, and another part is blank, is darkness, is absence of experience, and experimenters place an object in the blind region, a ball perhaps, and ask where it is, and the patient says, "I don't know, I can't see anything there." And the experimenter says, "Just guess. Point to where you think it is," and the patient reluctantly points, randomly it seems. And yet the pointing is accurate, is directed toward the ball, and the patient is surprised. Says it was just a lucky guess, has no feeling of seeing, no visual experience that guided the response, and yet the accuracy persists, trial after trial. And the paradox is that the patient is using visual information, is processing it, is responding to it, but is not conscious of it, is not experiencing it. And vision has split into two components: conscious experience and information processing. And these normally go together, but in blind sight they come apart. The blind sight phenomenon has been documented in multiple patients, studied extensively, and the mechanism involves intact pathways from the eye to brain regions outside the primary visual cortex. Pathways that process visual information for action and navigation without producing conscious experience. And these pathways allow blind sight patients to respond to visual stimuli without seeing them. And the existence of these pathways shows that vision is not a single unified process, but involves multiple systems, some conscious and some unconscious. And damage to visual cortex eliminates conscious vision, but leaves unconscious visual processing intact. And this dissociation reveals something fundamental about consciousness, shows that information processing is not sufficient for conscious experience, that the brain can process and use information without that information becoming conscious. Visualize vision as having multiple components. One component processes information for conscious perception, for seeing in the ordinary sense, for having visual experiences, and another component processes information for action, for guiding behaviour, for spatial navigation. And normally these components work together, are integrated, and we do not notice the distinction. But in blind sight they separate. One component is destroyed while the other remains, and the patient has action vision without perceptual vision, can use visual information for pointing and reaching, but cannot experience that information, cannot see it. And this shows that conscious experience is not simply a byproduct of information processing, but is a specific kind of processing, localized in specific brain regions. And when those regions are damaged, consciousness is lost even though other forms of visual processing continue. The blind sight paradox challenges functionalist theories of consciousness, theories that say consciousness is defined by functional roles, by what information does, by how it affects behavior, because in blind sight, visual information performs many of its normal functions, guides behavior, enables responses, but does not produce conscious experience. And so consciousness is not identical to function, is something additional, is a specific kind of processing beyond mere responsiveness to stimuli. And this supports theories that distinguish between access consciousness, the availability of information for cognitive processes, and phenomenal consciousness, the subjective experiential quality. And blind sight shows that these can come apart, that information can be accessed and used without being phenomenally conscious. One response to the blind sight paradox accepts that it shows consciousness is separate from certain functions, from certain kinds of information processing, but argues that this does not threaten physicalism, does not show that consciousness is non-physical, only that it is a specific physical process localized in specific brain regions. And blind sight is a case where some visual processing continues without the processing that produces conscious experience, and this is compatible with consciousness being physical, being identical to certain patterns of neural activity. And the paradox shows which patterns are necessary for consciousness, shows that primary visual cortex is essential, and this is progress in understanding the neural correlates of consciousness. Another response questions whether blindsight patients truly lack conscious experience, argues that they might have degraded or partial visual experiences that they do not recognize as vision, that do not match their expectations of what seeing should feel like. And when they say they see nothing, they mean they have no clear, vivid visual experience, but they might have vague feelings, subtle impressions that guide their guesses, and these impressions might be minimal forms of consciousness rather than pure unconscious processing. And this response denies the complete dissociation, argues that some phenomenology remains in blind sight, even if it is not ordinary visual phenomenology. A third response embraces the paradox as revealing that consciousness is not necessary for many cognitive functions, that unconscious processing is far more powerful than we thought, that the mind operates largely without awareness, and consciousness is only the tip of the iceberg, a small subset of mental processes, and blindsight is an extreme case, but similar dissociations occur in normal cognition, where we process information, make decisions, guide behavior without conscious awareness. And the paradox shows that consciousness, rather than being essential to cognition, is a specialized feature that occurs only in certain conditions, for certain kinds of information processing. The blindsight paradox also has implications for debates about animal consciousness, about which animals are conscious, because if information processing without consciousness is possible in humans, then it might be the norm in simpler animals. Animals might respond to stimuli, navigate environments, exhibit complex behaviors without having conscious experiences, without there being anything it is like to be them. And this makes determining animal consciousness more difficult, makes behavioral evidence insufficient, because behavior can be produced by unconscious processing, as blindsight demonstrates. The patient sits in the laboratory, the blind field tested again and again, and each time the accuracy surprises, the pointing succeeds, the guessing is correct, and the patient insists they see nothing, feel nothing, experience nothing in that region, and yet the information is there, is being used, is guiding behavior, and the paradox persists. Vision without seeing, processing without experience, function without phenomenology, and the blindsight paradox remains one of the most important phenomena in consciousness research, a real-world demonstration that conscious experience and information processing can dissociate, that the brain can use information the person does not consciously access, and that consciousness is not reducible to function, is something specific, something localized, something that can be lost while other aspects of vision remain. And the phenomenon continues to challenge theories of consciousness, continues to provide evidence about the neural basis of awareness, and continues to raise questions about what consciousness is, what purposes it serves, why it exists, and whether it is necessary for cognition or is instead a luxury, an addition, something that happens only when certain brain regions process information in certain ways. And the blindsight patient reaches into darkness and touches the object, accurate despite seeing nothing, and the paradox endures. The Banach-Tarski paradox. A solid sphere can be decomposed into a finite number of pieces, which can then be reassembled, using only rotations and translations, to form two solid spheres, each identical to the original. And this seems to violate conservation of volume, seems to create matter from nothing, seems to be impossible, and yet it is a theorem in mathematics, proven rigorously using the axiom of choice and the properties of infinite point sets. And this is the Banach-Tarski paradox, named after Stefan Banach and Alfred Tarski, who proved it in 1924. And the paradox reveals deep and counterintuitive features of infinite decompositions, of non-measurable sets, and of the relationship between mathematics and physical reality. The proof proceeds by decomposing the sphere into a finite number of pieces, typically 5 or 6, and each piece is a set of points, not a solid region with smooth boundaries but a scattered, disconnected, infinitely complex collection of points. And these pieces are non-measurable, meaning they do not have well-defined volumes in the usual sense. They cannot be assigned a size using standard measure theory, and this is crucial because measurable sets cannot be duplicated. Conservation of volume holds for measurable sets, but non-measurable sets escape this constraint. They can be rearranged in ways that seem to violate intuition, and the Banach-Tarski paradox exploits this by constructing pieces that are so pathological, so wildly scattered, that they can be rotated and translated to form two complete spheres. The decomposition uses the axiom of choice, the principle that given any collection of non-empty sets, there exists a way to choose one element from each set, and the axiom of choice is independent of the other axioms of set theory. It cannot be proven or disproven from the standard axioms, and some mathematicians reject it precisely because it leads to results, like the Banach-Tarski paradox, results that seem absurd, and rejecting the axiom of choice avoids the paradox. But it also cripples large parts of modern mathematics. Many important theorems depend on the axiom of choice, and most mathematicians accept it despite its counterintuitive consequences. The paradox applies only to objects in three-dimensional space, or higher. It does not work in 2 dimensions. A disk cannot be decomposed and reassembled into 2 disks. And this is because the group of rotations in the plane is amenable, meaning it admits a certain kind of averaging that prevents paradoxical decompositions, while the group of rotations in 3-dimensional space is non-amenable, and this non-amenability is what makes the Banach-Tarski paradox possible. The fact that rotations in 3 dimensions can be combined in ways that allow pieces to be moved around and duplicated. The paradox raises questions about the relationship between mathematical objects and physical objects, because while the Banach-Tarski theorem is mathematically rigorous, it does not imply that a physical sphere can be duplicated. The decomposition involves infinitely complex sets, pieces that are not solid regions but scattered collections of points, with no smooth boundaries, and such pieces cannot be physically realized, cannot be cut or manipulated, and so the paradox is a feature of mathematical idealizations rather than a claim about physical reality. And this distinction is important. The paradox shows that mathematical spheres treated as sets of points behave in strange ways, but it does not threaten conservation of mass or energy in physics, because physical objects are not sets of points but arrangements of atoms or fields or quantum states, and these are governed by physical laws that do not permit paradoxical duplication. Some mathematicians and philosophers argue that the Banach-Tarski paradox is not really a paradox but a theorem, a surprising result that reveals features of infinite point sets and non-measurable sets, and that calling it a paradox is misleading, suggesting contradiction when there is none, only counterintuitive behavior. And from this perspective, the paradox is valuable precisely because it challenges intuition, because it shows that infinite collections have properties that finite collections lack, that measure theory has limits, that the axiom of choice has strange consequences, and that mathematics is richer and stranger than naive expectations suggest. Others find the paradox troubling, a sign that something is wrong with the foundations, that the axiom of choice should be rejected or restricted, that non-measurable sets are pathological objects that should not be admitted into mathematics, and that theories which avoid such sets, like those based on constructive or intuitionistic logic, provide better foundations. And this debate reflects deeper disagreements about the nature of mathematical existence, about what kinds of objects mathematics should study, and about the role of intuition in guiding mathematical practice. The Banach-Tarski paradox also appears in discussions of probability and decision theory, because if a sphere can be decomposed into non-measurable pieces, then probability distributions on spheres must be carefully defined to avoid assigning probabilities to non-measurable sets. And this technical requirement reflects the same underlying issue, that not all collections of points can be measured, that probability requires measurability, and that attempting to assign probabilities to arbitrary sets leads to contradictions or paradoxes. The sphere sits on the table, solid and indivisible to the eye, but mathematically it is a set of infinitely many points. And the Banach-Tarski theorem says that these points can be partitioned into pieces, 5 or 6 strange scattered collections, and these pieces can be moved, rotated and translated and reassembled into 2 spheres, identical to the original, and the volume has doubled or seems to have doubled, but the pieces never had well-defined volumes. They were never measurable, and so nothing has been created, no conservation law has been violated, only the intuition that decomposition preserves size, and this intuition holds for finite decompositions, for measurable pieces, but fails for infinite non-measurable pieces, and the paradox endures. A theorem that sounds impossible, a result that challenges understanding, a demonstration that mathematics contains surprises, that infinity is stranger than imagination, that point sets behave in ways that solid objects do not, and that the axiom of choice, innocent as it seems, permits constructions that defy common sense, and the sphere duplicates, mathematically, if not physically. And the paradox remains, a permanent fixture in the landscape of mathematics, a result that students encounter with disbelief, that mathematicians accept as rigorous yet counterintuitive, and that philosophers debate as revealing something deep about the nature of mathematical objects, about the limits of measure theory, about the relationship between infinite idealization and finite reality. And the sphere sits there, unchanged and yet somehow doubled, a monument to the strangeness of infinity, to the power of the axiom of choice, and to the capacity of mathematics to prove truths that seem like impossibilities. The analysis paradox. Philosophy has long been concerned with analysis, with taking complex concepts and breaking them down into simpler components, with providing definitions that specify the necessary and sufficient conditions for the application of a term, and this project of conceptual analysis seems both important and straightforward. We want to know what knowledge is, what justice is, what truth is, and we proceed by analysing these concepts, by stating explicitly what they mean, by giving definitions that capture their essential features. Yet there is a paradox lurking here, a puzzle about whether analysis is even possible. And this is the paradox of analysis, first articulated clearly by C.H. Langford, and discussed extensively by G.E. Moore and others in the early 20th century. The paradox can be stated simply. Suppose we offer an analysis of some concept. For example, we might analyse the concept brother as male sibling, and this analysis, if correct, should be informative, should tell us something we did not already know about what brotherhood consists in, should illuminate the concept by making its structure explicit. But if the analysis is correct, then the analysandum, the concept being analysed, and the analysans, the analysis itself, must have the same meaning. They must be synonymous, otherwise the analysis would be incorrect. It would not capture what brotherhood really is. And if they are synonymous, then the statement brother means male sibling should be trivial, should be like saying brother means brother, a mere tautology that provides no new information. And so the analysis cannot be both correct and informative. If it is correct, then it is trivial. And if it is informative, then it is not a genuine analysis, but merely a stipulation or a proposed change of meaning. The paradox threatens the entire project of conceptual analysis, because it suggests that analysis cannot do what it is supposed to do, cannot both correctly identify the meaning of a concept and provide new insight into that meaning, cannot be both true and interesting. And so either conceptual analysis is impossible, or our understanding of what analysis is and what it aims to achieve must be revised. One response to the paradox distinguishes between sense and reference, between the meaning of a term and what it picks out, and argues that an analysis can be informative even if the analysandum and analysans refer to the same thing, because they can differ in sense, in the way they present or describe that thing. And so the analysis brother means male sibling is informative, because even though brother and male sibling refer to the same set of individuals, they present that set in different ways, one as a family relation and the other as a combination of gender and kinship. And this difference in sense makes the identity statement informative rather than trivial. Another response appeals to a distinction between conceptual and factual knowledge, arguing that analysis does not provide factual knowledge about the world, but conceptual knowledge about our own concepts, that it makes explicit what was already implicit in our understanding, that it brings to consciousness the structure of concepts that we already possess and use, but have not fully articulated. And so, the informativeness of analysis is not the informativeness of discovering new facts, but the informativeness of self-clarification, of making our own conceptual commitments explicit and transparent. A third response associated with Quine and others skeptical of the analytic-synthetic distinction denies that there is a sharp line between conceptual analysis and empirical investigation, arguing that all beliefs form a holistic web where conceptual revisions and factual discoveries are intertwined, and that what we call analysis is really just careful reflection on our current best theory of the world, subject to revision in light of new evidence or theoretical considerations. And on this view, the paradox dissolves, because analysis is not supposed to be a priori or purely conceptual, but is continuous with empirical inquiry, and so it can be both correct and informative without any mystery. The paradox also raises questions about the methodology of philosophy, about whether philosophy can make progress through analysis or whether some other method is needed. And different philosophical traditions have taken different stances, with analytic philosophy traditionally emphasizing conceptual analysis as a central tool, while continental philosophy has been more skeptical of analysis, focusing instead on interpretation, critique, and phenomenological description. And the paradox of analysis has been one factor driving some philosophers away from traditional analysis toward other approaches. The paradox connects to issues about understanding and competence, because we seem to have a kind of implicit or tacit understanding of concepts like knowledge, justice, and truth. We can use these concepts correctly, can apply them to particular cases, can recognize when they are used inappropriately, and yet when asked to state explicitly what these concepts mean, to provide a definition, we struggle. And this suggests that conceptual competence does not require explicit knowledge of definitions, that understanding can be practical and procedural rather than theoretical and propositional, and that analysis attempts to convert implicit understanding into explicit knowledge, a conversion that is difficult and perhaps impossible to complete without remainder. The paradox also appears in the context of philosophical disagreement, because philosophers have been offering analyses of key concepts for millennia, and yet consensus remains elusive. Different philosophers provide different analyses of knowledge, of justice, of truth, and it is not always clear how to adjudicate between competing analyses, whether by appeal to intuitions about particular cases, by considerations of theoretical simplicity and fruitfulness, or by some other standard. And the lack of agreement raises the question of whether these concepts have determinate meanings that analysis can discover, or whether they are vague, contested, or essentially contested, such that no single analysis could capture all the ways they are legitimately used. The analysis paradox remains a puzzle at the heart of philosophy, a question about what philosophy is doing when it offers definitions and analyses, whether it is discovering pre-existing meanings, stipulating new ones, or engaging in some more complex activity that combines elements of discovery, stipulation, and rational reconstruction, and the paradox has not been definitively resolved. Different philosophers find different responses more or less compelling, and the debate continues, with implications for how we understand the nature and methods of philosophical inquiry. And the concept sits there, waiting to be analysed, inviting us to state its essence, to specify its conditions, to make explicit what we already implicitly know, and yet the analysis, when offered, seems either to tell us nothing new or to change the subject, to offer a different concept rather than clarifying the original one. And the paradox persists, a thorn in the side of analysis, a reminder that understanding is more elusive than it appears, that the gap between knowing how to use a concept and knowing what it means is wider than we thought, and that philosophy, despite its ancient commitment to clarity and definition, to making the implicit explicit and the confused clear, may be chasing a goal that is inherently problematic, inherently paradoxical, a goal that recedes as we approach it, that becomes more obscure the more we try to illuminate it, and yet we continue to analyse, to offer definitions, to seek clarity, because the alternative, giving up on understanding, seems worse. The arrow paradox. Motion seems so simple, so obvious. An arrow flies through the air from bow to target, and no one doubts that it moves. Yet the ancient Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea posed a question that has troubled thinkers for over 2,000 years, a question about whether motion is even possible at all. And this is the arrow paradox, one of Zeno's many arguments against the reality of change and multiplicity. Consider an arrow in flight, frozen at a single instant of time. At that precise moment, the arrow occupies a specific region of space exactly equal to its own length and width. It is not in two places at once. It is simply where it is, motionless, static, indistinguishable from an arrow at rest. At the next instant, the same is true. The arrow occupies a space equal to itself, motionless at that frozen moment, and at the next instant, and the next. And if time is composed of a sequence of such instants, then at every instant the arrow is motionless. And if the arrow is motionless at every instant, then how can it be said to move at all? For motion would require the arrow to be in more than one place at a single instant, or to be in a state of transition rather than a state of rest, and yet at any given instant there is no motion, only position. Zeno used this paradox to support the Eleatic philosophy of Parmenides, which held that change and motion are illusions, that reality is a single, unchanging whole, and that the apparent diversity and movement we perceive are mere deceptions of the senses. The arrow paradox strikes at the very concept of instantaneous velocity, the idea that an object has a speed at a single moment in time, and Aristotle attempted to refute Zeno by arguing that time is not composed of indivisible instants, but is continuous, that motion is not a series of static positions, but a process that unfolds over intervals, and that the paradox arises only if we mistakenly treat time as a collection of frozen moments, rather than a flowing continuum. Modern physics offers a different resolution through calculus, where velocity is defined as the derivative of position with respect to time, a limit that describes how position changes as the time interval approaches zero. And in this framework, instantaneous velocity is a well-defined concept. The arrow does have a speed at each moment, even though speed is not a property that can be observed in a single instant, but only inferred from the relationship between position and time. Yet some philosophers argue that the arrow paradox still points to something genuine and unresolved, a mystery about how the static and the dynamic relate, how a series of stillnesses can add up to motion, how being in a place can somehow become moving between places. Quantum mechanics adds another layer to the puzzle, because at the subatomic level, particles do not have definite positions and velocities simultaneously. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle states that the more precisely we know a particle's position, the less precisely we can know its momentum. And in some sense, the arrow paradox prefigures this strange quantum behavior, the idea that motion and position are not entirely compatible descriptions of reality. The paradox also connects to debates about the nature of time itself, whether time is discrete or continuous, whether it flows or is an illusion, whether the present moment is all that exists or whether past and future are equally real, and whether change is fundamental or derivative. Zeno's arrow hangs suspended in thought, motionless at every instant, yet undeniably in flight. A puzzle that refuses to vanish despite millennia of analysis. A reminder that even the most basic experiences, the flight of an arrow, the passing of time, the reality of motion, rest on assumptions that can be questioned, that beneath the surface of the obvious lies a tangle of conceptual difficulties that no amount of mathematics or physics has entirely smoothed away, and the arrow flies still, or perhaps it never moved at all, frozen forever in the paradox that bears its name. Russell's paradox. In the year 1901, a young mathematician named Bertrand Russell discovered a contradiction so profound that it shattered the foundations of mathematics and forced an entire generation of logicians to rebuild their discipline from the ground up. And this contradiction became known as Russell's paradox, a simple question about sets that revealed a fatal flaw in the way mathematicians understood collections and categories. A set is merely a collection of objects, and sets can contain anything: numbers, colours, ideas, even other sets. And at first this seems harmless enough. A set of all chairs, a set of all prime numbers, a set of all books ever written. Some sets contain themselves as members and some do not. And this too seems straightforward. A catalogue of all catalogues would include itself because it is also a catalogue, while a list of all fruit does not include itself because a list is not a fruit. Russell posed a deceptively innocent question. Consider the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. Does this set contain itself? And the mind stumbles immediately into contradiction. If the set contains itself, then by definition it should not contain itself, because the rule states it only includes sets that do not contain themselves. But if it does not contain itself, then it must include itself, because it fits the criteria perfectly. And so the paradox loops without end, a perfect logical knot that cannot be untied. This was not merely a clever riddle or a philosophical curiosity, it was a disaster for mathematics, because at the time, mathematicians believed they could organize all of mathematical knowledge using set theory, a system proposed by Georg Cantor that treated sets as the fundamental building blocks of reality. But Russell's paradox proved that naive set theory was inconsistent, that it allowed contradictions to exist within its structure, and if contradictions are permitted, then anything can be proven true or false, rendering the entire system useless. Russell himself compared the paradox to a barber in a village who shaves all and only those men who do not shave themselves. And the question arises, does the barber shave himself? And if he does, then he should not, because he only shaves men who do not shave themselves. But if he does not, then he must, because he shaves all men who do not shave themselves. And the loop tightens again. Mathematicians scrambled to patch the damage, and various solutions emerged over the following decades. Zermelo and Frankel developed a new version of set theory that imposed strict rules about which sets could exist, forbidding the kind of self-reference that allowed Russell's paradox to form, while type theory introduced hierarchies that prevented sets from containing themselves by assigning different logical levels to different kinds of objects. Others embraced paraconsistent logic, systems that allow contradictions without collapse, or rejected the entire project of grounding mathematics in set theory, seeking new foundations altogether. Russell's paradox also influenced philosophy beyond mathematics, touching on questions of language, meaning, and self-reference, revealing that not all grammatically correct statements are logically coherent, that some sentences create traps from which reason cannot escape. The paradox appears in unexpected places. In computer science, where recursive definitions can cause programs to crash, in legal systems where laws reference themselves in contradictory ways, in everyday thought whenever categories attempt to classify themselves. It stands as a reminder that even the most rigorous systems of thought contain limits, that logic itself is not immune to paradox, that the quest for certainty and completeness may be forever haunted by statements that twist back on themselves and devour their own meaning. Synesthesia. Paradox. Why numbers have colours and sounds have tastes. A person looks at the number 5 and sees it as blue, not imagines it as blue, not associates it with blue, but actually sees blue, experiences colour as an intrinsic property of the number. And another person hears music and tastes chocolate, hears certain chords, and the taste appears involuntarily, automatically. And these experiences are synesthesia, are cross-modal sensory experiences where stimulation in one modality produces perception in another. And synesthesia is not metaphor, is not learned association, is a genuine perceptual phenomenon experienced by roughly 4% of the population. And the paradox is that synesthetes experience properties that are not physically present, see colours that are not in the stimulus, taste flavours that have no source, and yet these experiences are consistent, are reliable. The same numbers always evoke the same colours, the same sounds always evoke the same tastes, and this reliability distinguishes synesthesia from imagination or association, shows that synesthesia is automatic, is perceptual rather than cognitive, and the phenomenon reveals something fundamental about how the brain is organised, shows that sensory modalities are not strictly separate, but can communicate, can influence each other, and synesthesia represents an extreme of this cross-modal interaction, represents a neural architecture where connections between sensory areas are stronger than normal, are sufficient to produce conscious experiences in one modality when another is stimulated. Imagine being a grapheme colour synesthete, the most common form where letters and numbers evoke colours, and you read this text and every letter has its own colour. A is red, B is green, C is yellow, and the colours are vivid, are as clear as real colours, are not vague or imagined but are perceptually present. And when you see the letter A, you cannot help but see red. The colour is automatic, is triggered by the visual form of the letter, and this colouring happens for all letters and numbers, creates a richly coloured experience of reading. And while this might sound beautiful, it can also be distracting, can interfere with reading when the printed colours conflict with synesthetic colours, can create confusion. And yet for synesthetes, this is normal, is how the world has always looked. And they are often surprised to learn that others do not experience letters as coloured, that the colours are unique to synesthetes. Synesthesia demonstrates that perception is not modular, is not strictly segregated by sensory modality, and in synesthetes there is cross-activation. There are connections between sensory areas that do not exist or are weaker in non-synesthetes, and these connections allow activity in one area to trigger activity in another. And when grapheme area, the region that processes letter and number shapes, is activated, it also activates colour area, the region that processes colour, and this cross-activation produces the experience of coloured letters. And neuroimaging studies have confirmed this, have shown that when synesthetes see numbers, colour areas of visual cortex are activated, are lit up, and this activation is automatic, is bottom-up, is not produced by conscious thought or imagination, but is triggered by the stimulus itself. Visualize the brain as having sensory areas that are normally separate: visual area, auditory area, taste area, and these areas process their respective inputs and pass information to higher level regions. But in synesthetes there are additional connections. There are pathways between sensory areas that allow direct crosstalk, and these pathways are the neural basis of synesthesia, are what allows stimulation in one modality to produce experiences in another. And the connections are not learned, are not created through experience, but are developmental, are present from early life. And synesthesia is lifelong, is consistent. The same cross-modal experiences occurring throughout the synesthete's life. The synesthesia paradox is that these experiences are perceptual, are as real as any other perception, and yet the properties perceived are not present in the stimulus. The number 5 is not blue, is black on white, and yet the synesthete sees blue. And this challenges theories that say perception is veridical, is accurate, is a representation of physical reality. And synesthesia shows that perception can include properties that are not in the world, that are generated internally, and yet these properties feel external, feel like properties of objects rather than like internal mental states. And this raises questions about the nature of perception, about what it means for perception to be of something, about whether all perception involves some degree of construction, some degree of adding properties that are not in the stimulus. One theory of synesthesia is that everyone is born with extensive cross-modal connections, that infant brains have connections between all sensory areas, and during development, most of these connections are pruned, are eliminated, and sensory areas become more segregated. And in synesthetes, some of these early connections are preserved, are not pruned, and this preservation allows the cross-modal experiences to continue into adulthood. And this theory is supported by evidence that infants show some synesthetic effects, show cross-modal correspondences, and that synesthesia runs in families, has a genetic component, suggesting that genes that regulate synaptic pruning are involved. Another theory is that synesthesia involves disinhibition, involves normally present connections between sensory areas that are usually inhibited, are suppressed, and in synesthetes this inhibition is weakened, is less effective, and so the connections are active, allow cross-activation, and this theory is supported by evidence that synesthesia can be induced temporarily in non-synesthetes through drugs that reduce inhibition, through hypnosis, through sensory deprivation, suggesting that the neural machinery for synesthesia is present in everyone, but is normally inhibited, and synesthetes have less inhibition, have more open channels between sensory areas. Synesthesia also has practical implications. Some synesthetes report that their experiences are useful, provide memory aids, make information more distinctive, easier to remember, and some musicians with sound colour synesthesia report that the colours help with composition, with understanding musical structure, and some artists deliberately cultivate synesthetic experiences, use them as sources of creativity. And understanding synesthesia has implications for education, for recognising that people process information differently, that sensory experiences vary across individuals, and that teaching should accommodate these differences, should recognise that some students have richly coloured experiences of letters and numbers, while others do not. The phenomenon also raises questions about consciousness, about qualia, about the subjective properties of experience, because synesthetes have different qualia than non-synesthetes, have colour experiences that others do not, and this shows that consciousness is not uniform, is not the same across individuals, and qualia vary, and this variation is not just quantitative, is not just more or less of the same experience, but is qualitative, involves entirely different types of experience, and this challenges theories that say consciousness is universal, is the same for everyone, and supports theories that say consciousness is individual, is constructed by each brain in potentially different ways. And synesthesia is one example of this variation, is one way that consciousness can differ. Some philosophers argue that synesthesia shows that perception is not representational, does not represent external properties, because the colours seen by graphema colour synesthetes do not represent anything in the world. The number 5 is not blue, and yet the colour is perceived, and this challenges representational theories of perception, suggests that perceptual experiences are not always representations of external properties but can be internally generated responses. And synesthesia is a case where the response includes properties that are not being represented, and this raises questions about what makes perception representational, whether all aspects of perception are representations or whether some are merely responses, are produced by the perceptual system, without representing anything external. The number appears black on white, and the synesthete sees blue, vivid, and automatic. The colour is as real as the number, is as perceptually present, and yet the colour is not there, is not in the stimulus, is generated by the brain, is a cross-modal activation, and the synesthesia paradox remains. Perception includes non-veridical properties, includes experiences that do not correspond to stimulus properties, and yet these experiences are automatic, are reliable, are as perceptually real as any other, and synesthesia endures as one of the most fascinating phenomena in neuroscience. A demonstration that sensory modalities are not strictly separate, that cross-modal connections exist, that perception can include internally generated properties, and that consciousness varies across individuals, includes experiences that are unique, that are not shared by everyone, and the colours remain overlaid on letters, triggered by sounds, evoked by tastes, and the cross-modal world of synesthetes continues, different from the world non-synesthetes perceive, richer in some ways, more confusing in others, and the phenomenon persists. Schrödinger's cat, the pet that's both alive and dead. A cat sits in a sealed box, a box that cannot be opened or observed from the outside. And inside the box with the cat is a device, a quantum mechanism that has a 50% chance of killing the cat within 1 hour and a 50% chance of leaving the cat alive. Perhaps a vial of poison that will break if a single radioactive atom decays. And the decay is a quantum event, genuinely random, with no way to predict whether it will happen in the next hour. And so after 1 hour has passed, the cat is either alive or dead. 50-50 odds. And this seems straightforward, but the paradox emerges when quantum mechanics is taken seriously, when the rules of quantum theory are applied consistently, because quantum mechanics says that before a measurement is made, before the box is opened and the cat is observed, the system exists in a superposition, a combination of both possible states simultaneously. And so the cat is both alive and dead at the same time, existing in a strange limbo where neither state is definite until observation collapses the superposition and forces the system into one state or the other. And this is Schrödinger's cat, a thought experiment devised by physicist Erwin Schrödinger in 1935 to illustrate what he saw as the absurdity of applying quantum mechanics to macroscopic objects to show that something was wrong with the standard interpretation of quantum theory. Imagine the situation step by step. At the beginning, the cat is alive, the radioactive atom has not yet decayed, and the quantum state is well defined. But as time passes, the atom enters a superposition of decayed and not decayed, because quantum mechanics describes it with a wave function that assigns amplitudes to both possibilities, and these amplitudes evolve smoothly, and the atom is in a state of quantum indeterminacy, neither definitely decayed nor definitely not decayed until a measurement is made. And this indeterminacy is not ignorance, not a matter of the atom being in one state or the other, and we just do not know which, but a genuine feature of quantum reality. The atom literally does not have a definite state until measured, and because the poison release is coupled to the atom's state, the poison is both released and not released, and the cat is both dead and alive, existing in a superposition of macroscopic states. And this conclusion seems absurd, seems to violate everything we know about cats and boxes and life and death, and Schrödinger intended it to be absurd, to show that something must be wrong with the orthodox interpretation of quantum mechanics, that the theory cannot be applied consistently to large objects, that there must be a boundary somewhere between the quantum realm, where superpositions occur, and the classical realm, where objects have definite states. The paradox has generated an enormous amount of discussion and debate in physics and philosophy, with different interpretations of quantum mechanics offering different resolutions. The Copenhagen interpretation, the dominant view in Schrödinger's time, says that the wave function collapses upon measurement, that the act of observation forces the system into one definite state. And so when the box is opened and the cat is observed, the superposition collapses and the cat becomes definitely alive or definitely dead. But this raises questions about what counts as a measurement, about what constitutes an observer, about whether consciousness is required to collapse the wave function, or whether any physical interaction suffices. And these questions remain controversial, and the Copenhagen interpretation does not provide clear answers, does not specify where the quantum classical boundary lies. The many worlds interpretation offers a different resolution, saying that the wave function never collapses, that both outcomes occur, that the universe splits into two branches, one where the cat is alive and one where the cat is dead, and both branches are equally real. And the observer also splits, becoming two versions, one observing a live cat and one observing a dead cat. And each version believes they have observed a definite outcome. But from a global perspective, both outcomes happen. And the superposition is resolved not by collapse but by branching. And this interpretation avoids the measurement problem, avoids the need to specify what counts as a measurement. But it introduces other difficulties: the proliferation of parallel worlds, the question of what it means for both outcomes to be real, and whether this is a genuine solution or merely a reformulation of the problem. Decoherence theory provides another perspective, focusing on the interaction between the quantum system and its environment, and it shows that macroscopic objects like cats are constantly interacting with their surroundings, with air molecules, with photons, with thermal radiation, and these interactions cause the quantum coherence, the delicate phase relationships that allow superpositions to be destroyed very rapidly in a fraction of a second for macroscopic objects. And once coherence is lost, the system behaves classically, appears to be in one definite state, and so the cat never actually exists in a superposition of alive and dead, or exists in such a state for only an immeasurably short time before decoherence converts it to a classical mixture, a probabilistic state where the cat is either alive or dead. We just do not know which until we look. And this dissolves the paradox by denying that macroscopic superpositions persist long enough to be observable. The paradox also raises questions about the role of consciousness in quantum mechanics, about whether an observer must be conscious to collapse the wave function, and some interpretations suggest that consciousness plays a special role, that the cat remains in superposition until a conscious being opens the box and perceives the outcome. And this view has been criticized as mystical, as importing mind into physics in ways that are unnecessary and unhelpful. And most physicists reject it, preferring interpretations that treat measurement as a physical process involving interactions with macroscopic devices, not requiring consciousness. But the question remains open, debated, unresolved, and Schrödinger's cat sits at the center of this debate, a symbol of the deep puzzles that quantum mechanics presents. Visualize the box, sealed and opaque, and inside the cat waits, and the quantum device ticks, and the atom hovers in superposition. And according to quantum mechanics, the entire contents of the box, the atom, the device, the poison, the cat, all exist in a superposition of two macroscopically distinct states: alive, cat no decay, and dead cat decay. And this superposition is described by a wave function that smoothly evolves, and the two branches of the wave function correspond to two different realities. And yet before the box is opened, there is only one box, one cat, one system. And the paradox is that quantum mechanics seems to say the cat is both alive and dead. While common sense says the cat is either alive or dead, we just do not know which. And this clash between quantum formalism and classical intuition is the heart of Schrödinger's cat, a paradox that has no agreed upon solution, that different interpretations resolve in different ways, and that continues to drive research in the foundations of quantum mechanics, in efforts to understand what measurement means, what quantum states represent, and how the quantum world relates to the classical world we experience. The box sits on the table, the hour passes, and the cat's fate is sealed. Or is it? Or is the cat in limbo, suspended between life and death, waiting for observation to make reality definite? And the paradox endures, not because physicists do not understand quantum mechanics, but because quantum mechanics, understood correctly, leads to conclusions that seem impossible, that violate everyday experience, that force choices between interpretations that are empirically equivalent but conceptually divergent. And Schrödinger's cat remains the most famous illustration of this strangeness, a thought experiment that has entered popular culture, a paradox that symbolizes the weirdness of quantum reality. And the cat, alive and dead, real and hypothetical, continues to haunt physics and philosophy, a permanent reminder that the quantum world is not merely different in degree from the classical world, but different in kind, governed by rules that defy visualization and resist intuitive understanding. And the paradox persists, unresolved in the deepest sense, a puzzle that reveals the limits of human intuition and the challenge of making sense of a theory that works perfectly in practice but remains mysterious in principle. Quine's Gavagai problem? Why we can never know what anyone really means. An anthropologist arrives in a remote village to study an unknown language, a language no outsider has encountered before. And the anthropologist has no translator, no dictionary, no common linguistic framework, only observations and patience, and the method is radical translation. Learning the language from scratch by observing how natives use words in response to events. And one day, a rabbit runs past and a native points and says Gavagai, and the anthropologist writes in the notebook, Gavagai means rabbit. And this seems reasonable, seems like an obvious inference. The native saw a rabbit and said Gavagai, so Gavagai must refer to rabbits. But philosopher Willard Van Orman Quine points out a problem, a deep problem about meaning and translation. Because Gavagai might mean rabbit, but it might also mean undetached rabbit part, or rabbit stage, or collection of rabbit molecules, or instance of rabbithood. And all these translations are consistent with the native's behaviour. All would lead the native to say Gavagai in exactly the same circumstances, whenever a rabbit is present, and there is no fact of the matter, no objective truth about which translation is correct, no way to determine what Gavagai really means. And this indeterminacy is not due to practical limitations, not due to insufficient evidence, but is fundamental, is a consequence of how meaning works. And this is Quine's Gavagai problem, also called the problem of indeterminacy of translation, a challenge to the idea that words have determinate meanings, that translation has right answers, and that we can know what others mean when they speak. Imagine trying to distinguish between Gavagai means rabbit and Gavagai means undetached rabbit part. And you point to the rabbit and the native says Gavagai, and you point to the rabbit's ear and ask whether this is Gavagai, and the native responds, but you do not know whether the response means yes because the ear is an undetached rabbit part, or no, because the ear is not a whole rabbit, or something else entirely. And every test you design, every question you ask, can be interpreted in multiple ways, can be answered consistently by multiple translations, and no amount of observation, no behavioural evidence can definitively settle which translation is correct, because the native's behaviour under all possible circumstances is compatible with multiple interpretations. And Quine argues that this shows meaning is indeterminate, that there is no fact about what Gavagai really means, only different translation manuals that work equally well, that map the native's language onto ours in different but equally legitimate ways. The problem generalizes beyond anthropology to all understanding of language, because even when we share a language, even when we both speak English, the Gavagai problem applies. We cannot be certain that we mean the same thing by our words, that rabbit means to you what it means to me. We might be using different concepts, carved up differently, but our behavior is similar enough that we never notice the difference. And this raises the disturbing possibility that communication is always partial, always approximate, that we never fully understand each other, that meaning is not something objective that words have, but something we impose through interpretation, and different interpretations can fit the evidence equally well, and there is no transcendent perspective from which to judge which interpretation is correct. Visualize meaning as a relationship between words and world, and Quine's point is that this relationship is underdetermined by behavior, by the evidence available to translators, because infinitely many relationships are consistent with the same behavioral evidence. Infinitely many ways of mapping words to world produce the same observable patterns, and choosing among these possibilities requires going beyond evidence, requires making decisions that are not forced by facts, and these decisions constitute meaning rather than discovering it. And so meaning is partially conventional, partially stipulated, not fully determined by reality. The Gavagai problem challenges referential theories of meaning, theories that say words mean things because they refer to objects in the world, because rabbit refers to rabbits, and water refers to water, and Quine's argument shows that reference is inscrutable, cannot be determined from behaviour alone, because words can be interpreted as referring to different things, different ways of carving up reality, and all interpretations fit the evidence, and so reference is not an objective relation, but is relative to a translation manual, relative to a scheme of interpretation, and different manuals. Different schemes can assign different references to the same words while remaining equally correct. One response to the Gavagai problem accepts the indeterminacy, embraces it as a truth about meaning, argues that Quine is right, that there is no fact of the matter about what words mean beyond what is determined by behavioural evidence, and meaning is holistic, depends on the entire network of beliefs and language practices. And translation manuals are theoretical frameworks that organise this evidence. And like all theories, they are underdetermined by data, and multiple theories fit the same data equally well. And choosing among them involves pragmatic considerations, simplicity, utility, coherence, but not truth in any absolute sense. And this response treats meaning as a human construction, something we create through practices rather than something we discover in nature. Another response denies the indeterminacy, argues that Quine's thought experiment is artificial, that in real translation situations additional evidence is available, evidence about intentions, about how speakers correct each other, about the structure of their conceptual schemes. And this additional evidence narrows down the possibilities, rules out bizarre interpretations like undetached rabbit part, and determines that Gavagai means rabbit in the ordinary sense. And while perfect certainty may be impossible, practical determinacy is achievable, and meaning is objective enough for communication to succeed, for translation to have right and wrong answers. And the Gavagai problem is an epistemological worry, a concern about how we know what words mean, but it does not show that words lack determinate meanings, only that discovering those meanings is difficult. A third response appeals to charity, to the principle that we should interpret speakers as making sense, as having coherent beliefs, as speaking truly most of the time. And this principle constrains translation, rules out interpretations that make speakers irrational or massively mistaken. And while charity does not uniquely determine translation, it narrows the range of acceptable interpretations, and combined with simplicity and other pragmatic virtues, it makes translation tractable, makes it possible to arrive at good translations, even if not perfect ones. And this response treats translation as an interpretive practice, guided by norms rather than as a purely empirical investigation, guided only by behaviour. The Gavagai problem also connects to broader philosophical issues about realism and anti-realism, about whether there are objective facts independent of our theories and languages. Because if meaning is indeterminate, then perhaps reality itself is indeterminate. Perhaps there is no fact about whether rabbits or undetached rabbit parts exist, only different ways of organising experience. different conceptual schemes that carve up the world differently. And Quine's ontological relativity, his claim that what objects exist is relative to a language or theory, follows from the Gavagai problem, from the recognition that reference is inscrutable, that we cannot say what exists absolutely, but only what exists relative to a framework. The anthropologist sits with a notebook, the word Gavagai recorded, the translation uncertain, and the native speaks, and the anthropologist interprets, and communication proceeds approximately, pragmatically, successfully enough for practical purposes, and whether Gavagai really means rabbit or something else remains undetermined, remains a question without an answer, and Quine's problem persists, not as a practical obstacle to translation, but as a philosophical challenge to theories of meaning, as a demonstration that meaning is more elusive than we thought, more dependent on interpretation and less determined by facts. And the Gavagai problem endures as one of Quine's most influential contributions, a thought experiment that changed how philosophers think about language, about meaning, about translation, and about the relationship between words and world. And the problem remains unsolved, perhaps unsolvable, a permanent feature of linguistic philosophy, a reminder that understanding each other is harder than it seems, that meaning is indeterminate, that communication is an achievement rather than an automatic consequence of shared language, and that the gap between what we say and what we mean, between our words and their reference, can never be fully closed. And the rabbit runs past and the native says, Gavagai, and we translate approximately, hopefully, never quite certain that we have understood. The Achilles and the tortoise. Achilles, the swift-footed hero of Greek legend, agrees to race a tortoise, and to make the contest fair, the tortoise is given a head start, perhaps 100 meters, and the race begins, and Achilles runs swiftly toward the point where the tortoise started, but by the time he reaches that point, the tortoise has moved forward a small distance, perhaps 10 meters, and so Achilles runs toward that new position, but again by the time he arrives, the tortoise has advanced a bit further, perhaps 1 meter, and this process continues. Each time Achilles reaches where the tortoise was, the tortoise has moved ahead, and it seems that Achilles can never quite catch up, never quite overtake the slower creature, and yet common sense insists that of course Achilles will pass the tortoise. That speed wins races, that the faster runner always overtakes the slower given enough time and distance. And this contradiction between logic and intuition is Zeno's most famous paradox, a puzzle that has captivated philosophers and mathematicians for over 2 millennia. Zeno of Elea constructed this argument in the 5th century BCE as part of his defense of Parmenidean monism, the idea that reality is one unchanging whole and that motion and plurality are illusions. And the paradox was meant to show that the concept of motion leads to absurdity, that if we accept that space and time can be divided infinitely, then the faster can never overtake the slower. And since this conclusion is obviously false, something must be wrong with our assumptions about motion and change. The paradox rests on the idea that Achilles must complete infinitely many tasks, reaching the first point where the tortoise was, then the second, then the third, and so on without end. And if each task takes some amount of time, however small, then infinitely many tasks would require infinite time. And yet in reality, Achilles catches and passes the tortoise in a finite time. And so where is the error? Aristotle argued that the paradox confuses potential and actual infinity, that while the path can be divided into infinitely many segments in thought, Achilles does not actually perform infinitely many separate actions. He simply runs, continuously and smoothly. And the infinite division is an artifact of analysis, not a feature of the motion itself. The resolution became clearer with the development of calculus, which showed that an infinite series of diminishing intervals can sum to a finite total, that 1 + 1/10 + 1/100th, and so on converges to a specific finite value. And so the infinite number of time intervals Achilles requires to reach each successive position also sum to a finite time, the time it takes him to overtake the tortoise. Yet the paradox retains a strange power, a sense that something about infinity remains counterintuitive, that the idea of completing an infinite number of steps feels impossible, even when mathematics insists it is not, and philosophers continue to debate whether the mathematical resolution truly captures the conceptual problem or merely sidesteps it. The paradox also connects to questions about the nature of space and time, whether they are continuous or discrete, whether motion is genuinely smooth or composed of tiny jumps, whether there is a smallest possible distance or duration beyond which reality cannot be divided. And these questions remain open in modern physics, where quantum mechanics and theories of spacetime suggest that the classical picture of smooth continuous motion may break down at the smallest scales. If you enjoy these explorations of paradox and the limits of thought, consider subscribing so you never miss a journey into philosophy's most perplexing puzzles, and perhaps leave a comment sharing where you are in the world as you listen to these ideas unfold. Achilles and the tortoise remain locked in their eternal race, a metaphor for the human attempt to reconcile the finite with the infinite, the continuous with the discrete, the logical with the intuitive. And the paradox endures as a reminder that even the simplest motion, a hero chasing a tortoise, conceals within it mysteries that have not been fully solved. Questions that linger at the boundary where mathematics meets reality, where reason meets experience, where what must be true, according to logic, clashes with what obviously is true, according to the world. Skolem's paradox. Set theory describes infinite sets of different sizes, and Georg Cantor proved that the real numbers are uncountably infinite, that they cannot be placed in one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers, that there are more real numbers than natural numbers. And this is one of the foundational results of modern mathematics, a theorem that establishes a hierarchy of infinities. But Thoralf Skolem discovered a paradox, or what appears to be a paradox, that threatens this result. And the paradox is that any consistent first-order theory that has an infinite model also has a countable model, a model where the domain consists of only countably many elements. And this is the Löwenheim-Skolem theorem, and applying it to set theory yields a troubling conclusion. If set theory is consistent, then it has a countable model, a model where the universe of sets is countably infinite. And yet within this model, the axioms of set theory are satisfied, including Cantor's theorem, which proves that the real numbers are uncountable. And so we have a countable model of set theory in which there exists an uncountable set. And this seems contradictory. How can a set be uncountable if the entire universe is countable? How can there be more real numbers than natural numbers if the whole model has only countably many elements? And this is Skolem's paradox. The resolution lies in understanding the distinction between internal and external perspectives, between how things appear from inside the model and how they appear from outside. From inside the countable model of set theory, all the axioms hold. Cantor's theorem is provable. The real numbers have no enumeration within the model. No bijection between the reals and the naturals exists as far as the model is concerned. And so internally, the reals are uncountable. But from outside the model, from the perspective of someone who can see the entire structure, the model itself has only countably many elements, and there exists a bijection between the elements of the model and the natural numbers. A bijection that is not itself an element of the model, that does not correspond to any set or function within the model. And so externally, the model is countable. And this distinction between internal and external is the key to resolving the paradox. Uncountability is relative. It depends on what bijections are available, and different models have different bijections. Skolem's paradox reveals something profound about the nature of mathematical existence and the limits of first-order logic. It shows that first-order logic cannot pin down the cardinality of infinite sets, that the concept of uncountability is not absolute but relative to a model, that what counts as uncountable in one model may be countable in another, and this relativity is a consequence of the expressive limitations of first-order logic, which can only quantify over elements of the domain, not over arbitrary functions or sets of elements, and so first-order set theory cannot express the existence of a bijection between two sets in an absolute way, cannot say, in a model-independent manner, that a set is countable or uncountable. Some philosophers and logicians find this relativity troubling, a sign that first-order set theory is inadequate as a foundation for mathematics, that a stronger logic, perhaps second-order logic, which allows quantification over sets and functions, is needed to capture the intended meaning of set-theoretic concepts. And in second-order logic, the Löwenheim-Skolem theorem does not hold. There are categorical characterizations of structures, including characterizations of the natural numbers and the real numbers that pin down their cardinality uniquely, and so second-order logic avoids Skolem's paradox by being more expressive, by allowing statements that distinguish countable from uncountable models. But second-order logic has its own difficulties. It lacks complete proof systems. There is no algorithmic procedure that can, in principle, prove all second-order truths, and so the gain in expressiveness comes at the cost of losing some of the nice logical properties that first-order logic enjoys. Others embrace the relativity revealed by Skolem's paradox, arguing that it shows the conventional or perspectival nature of mathematical concepts, that cardinality is not an intrinsic property of sets but a relation between sets and models, that what we call uncountable is simply a set that lacks an enumeration within a particular model, and that different models can disagree about what is countable without any of them being wrong. And this perspective aligns with a pluralistic or model-theoretic approach to mathematics, where there is no single intended model of set theory, but many models, each with its own internal structure, and what is true varies from model to model, and mathematical truth is relative to a choice of model. Skolem's paradox also connects to issues about the definiteness of the continuum, about whether the set of real numbers has a well-defined cardinality, and the continuum hypothesis, which asks whether there is a set whose cardinality is strictly between that of the natural numbers and the real numbers. And this hypothesis is independent of the standard axioms of set theory, meaning that neither the hypothesis nor its negation can be proven from the axioms. And some mathematicians interpret this independence as evidence that the cardinality of the continuum is not a definite matter of fact, but depends on additional assumptions or on the choice of model. And Skolem's paradox reinforces this interpretation by showing that even the distinction between countable and uncountable is model-dependent. The paradox remains a touchstone in the philosophy of mathematics and the foundations of logic. It illustrates the limits of first-order logic, the relativity of model-theoretic notions, and the gap between formal systems and intended interpretations. And it forces careful thinking about what it means to say that a set is countable or uncountable, about whether mathematical concepts have absolute meanings or are always relative to a framework, and about the relationship between syntactic provability and semantic truth. And the paradox has no simple resolution. Different philosophers and mathematicians draw different lessons, some seeing it as a defect of first-order logic, others as a feature revealing deep truths about the nature of infinity and cardinality. And the debate continues, with implications for how we understand the foundations of mathematics, the status of set theory, and the nature of mathematical truth. The countable model sits in logical space, containing sets and functions and real numbers, and within this model, Cantor's theorem holds. The reals are uncountable, no enumeration exists, but from outside the model, the whole structure is countable, all its elements can be listed, and the real numbers of the model, uncountable internally, are countable externally. And this doubling of perspective, this split between internal and external, is the heart of Scolam's paradox, a demonstration that perspective matters, that truth is not always absolute, that models can disagree, and that first-order logic, powerful as it is, cannot capture all the nuances of infinite cardinality. And the paradox endures, a puzzle that has shaped logic and set theory, a challenge that continues to generate discussion and debate, and a reminder that even the most basic mathematical concepts, even the notion of how many, become subtle and contested when applied to infinite collections. Nagel's bat problem: why you can never know what it's like to be anything else. A philosopher contemplates a bat hanging upside down in a cave, navigating through echolocation, emitting high-frequency sounds and listening to the echoes, building a sonic map of the world. And the philosopher asks what it is like to be a bat. What is the subjective character of bat experience? What does echolocation feel like from the inside? And philosopher Thomas Nagel argues that no amount of objective information about bat neuroscience, about bat behavior, about the physics of sonar, can tell us what bat experience is like, because subjective experience has an essential first-person character, a what it is likeness that cannot be captured from the third-person objective perspective of science. And the gap between objective description and subjective experience is unbridgeable. And this means that consciousness, at least in its subjective aspect, resists scientific explanation, resists reduction to physical terms. And this is Nagel's bat problem, presented in his famous 1974 paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And the problem illustrates the explanatory gap between physical facts and phenomenal facts, shows that subjective experience involves something that objective science cannot capture, and challenges physicalist theories of mind to explain how subjective character could be accommodated within a purely physical framework. Imagine trying to know what echolocation is like, trying to understand bat experience from the inside, and you learn all the objective facts. Learn about the bat's auditory system, about how it processes echoes, about which brain regions are involved. And this knowledge is real, is valuable, tells you how echolocation works, but it does not tell you what it feels like, does not give you access to the bat's subjective experience, to the phenomenology of navigating by sound. And Nagel's point is that this gap is not due to practical limitations, not due to insufficient technology or incomplete knowledge, but is a fundamental gap between objective and subjective perspectives, between what can be known from outside and what can only be known from inside. And no amount of objective knowledge can bridge this gap, can provide access to subjective experience. The bat problem generalizes beyond bats to any creature with a different sensory modality, a different nervous system, a different form of consciousness. And Nagel uses bats because they are mammals, are relatively similar to humans, yet have a sensory mode, echolocation, that humans lack. And this combination makes the example vivid, makes the gap between human and bat experience clear. And if we cannot know what it is like to be a bat, then we certainly cannot know what it is like to be a fish, an insect, an octopus, creatures whose nervous systems and sensory worlds are even more alien. And this suggests that consciousness, in its subjective aspect, is fundamentally private, is accessible only to the being who has it, and different kinds of consciousness are mutually inaccessible, cannot be fully understood from outside. Visualize the subjective character of experience as the view from inside, the first-person perspective, the what it is likeness. And this perspective is essential to consciousness, is what makes consciousness consciousness rather than merely information processing. And Nagel argues that physicalism, the view that everything is physical, must either deny that subjective character exists, which seems false because we all know from our own case that consciousness has a subjective character, or must explain how subjective character could be physical, how objective physical facts could constitute subjective, first-person experiences. And this explanation is what physicalism has not provided, what the bat problem challenges physicalism to provide. One response to the bat problem accepts the explanatory gap, but denies that it shows anything metaphysical, argues that the gap is merely epistemological, is about the limits of what we can know rather than about the nature of reality, and consciousness might be physical, even though we cannot fully understand it from the objective third-person perspective. And just as we cannot know what it is like to be a bat, we also cannot know what it is like to be another human, cannot fully access their subjective experiences, and yet we do not conclude that human consciousness is non-physical. And so the bat problem shows limits of knowledge, but not limits of physicalism, shows that subjective experience has aspects that resist objective description, but not that these aspects are non-physical. Another response argues that future science might bridge the gap, might develop ways of understanding subjective character objectively, might create theories that capture phenomenology in physical terms, and our current inability to imagine how this could be done does not prove that it cannot be done. And Nagel's argument trades on current ignorance, assumes that the gap is permanent when it might be merely temporary, and this response is optimistic about the prospects for physicalist explanations of consciousness, believes that the hard problem and the bat problem will eventually be solved by scientific progress. A third response from Nagel's position argues that the bat problem reveals something deep about the structure of reality, that consciousness has an irreducibly subjective aspect, an aspect that cannot be captured by objective physical description. And this does not mean consciousness is non-physical in the sense of being immaterial or supernatural, but it means that physicalism, as traditionally conceived, is incomplete, misses something essential about consciousness, and a complete theory of reality must include both objective physical facts and subjective phenomenal facts. And these two kinds of facts cannot be reduced to each other. And this position is sometimes called naturalistic dualism, accepts that consciousness is natural, is part of the natural world, but denies that it is reducible to physics. The bat problem also has implications for artificial intelligence, for whether machines could be conscious, because if we cannot know what it is like to be a bat, then we also cannot know what it is like to be a computer, cannot know whether AI systems have subjective experiences, and the bat problem suggests that behavioral evidence is insufficient, that even if a machine passes every behavioral test, exhibits intelligence, responds appropriately to stimuli, we still cannot know whether there is something it is like to be that machine, whether there is subjective experience behind the behavior, and this creates a permanent epistemic barrier, a limit on what we can know about machine consciousness. The bat hangs in the cave, emitting sounds, perceiving the world through echoes, and its experience is alien, is inaccessible to human understanding. And Nagel's question remains, what is it like? And the answer is we do not know, cannot know, because knowing requires access to the subjective perspective, requires being the bat or having the bat's sensory and cognitive capacities, and neither is possible. And so bat consciousness remains a mystery, remains forever beyond human comprehension. And this mystery is not unique to bats but applies to all consciousness, to the fundamental subjectivity of experience, to the what it is likeness that defines phenomenal consciousness. And Nagel's bat problem endures as one of the most influential thought experiments in philosophy of mind, a vivid illustration of the explanatory gap, a challenge to physicalist theories, and a reminder that consciousness, in its subjective aspect, resists objective description, resists scientific reduction, and remains one of the deepest puzzles about the nature of mind and reality. And the bat flies through the cave, navigating by sound, living its bat life, having its bat experiences, and what those experiences are like remains unknown, remains unknowable. And the problem persists, the gap between objective knowledge and subjective experience, the difference between knowing about consciousness and knowing consciousness from the inside. And Nagel's question echoes, "What is it like to be a bat?" And no answer comes, no answer can come, and the problem stands as a permanent marker of the limits of objective understanding, the irreducible subjectivity of experience and the mystery at the heart of consciousness. Morton's Fork, when both choices lead to the same doom. A tax collector in 15th century England faces a dilemma when assessing how much wealthy citizens should pay, and the collector observes that some nobles live extravagantly, displaying their wealth openly, and others live frugally, claiming poverty. And Archbishop John Morton, serving as Lord Chancellor under King Henry VII, devises a strategy to extract taxes regardless of which lifestyle the noble chooses, and the strategy is simple and brutal. If a noble lives extravagantly, then clearly they have money and can afford to pay high taxes. And if a noble lives frugally, then clearly they are saving money and must have accumulated wealth and can afford to pay high taxes. And either way, the noble must pay. There is no escape, no strategy that avoids taxation. And this trap, where two apparently opposite choices lead to the same unwanted outcome, became known as Morton's Fork, named after the archbishop who wielded it. And the term has entered common usage to describe any situation where someone must choose between two options that both lead to the same undesirable result, where the appearance of choice masks the reality of inevitability. Imagine being a noble in Morton's England, weighing your options, trying to decide whether to live well or live simply, and realizing that either choice leads to heavy taxation, that the tax collector has closed off all escape routes, has constructed a logical trap where your strategy is irrelevant, where you lose regardless of what you choose. And this creates a sense of futility, a recognition that the game is rigged, that the appearance of agency is illusory. And Morton's Fork exemplifies a class of situations where apparent choices are not genuine choices, where different paths converge on the same destination, and the only real choice is whether to accept the inevitable or to refuse to play the game at all. The structure of Morton's Fork appears throughout logic, rhetoric, and strategy. Wherever someone constructs an argument that covers all cases, that shows that regardless of what premises are accepted, a certain conclusion follows, and such arguments can be powerful tools of persuasion, can trap opponents in positions where they cannot escape the conclusion, but they can also be fallacious, can hide implicit assumptions or false dichotomies, can present apparent inevitability that dissolves under scrutiny. And distinguishing genuine Morton's Forks from apparent ones requires careful analysis of whether the two paths really do lead to the same conclusion, or whether there are hidden differences, hidden escape routes. Visualize the fork as a Y-shaped path, two branches diverging, one path representing extravagance and one representing frugality, and both paths lead to the same destination. The tax collector's office and the noble walking either path arrives at the same place. And the fork is not a choice between outcomes, but a choice between routes to a predetermined outcome. And the futility comes from recognizing that movement, that action, that strategy, all are pointless, all lead to the same end, and the only way to avoid the destination is to refuse to walk, to opt out of the entire framework. Morton's Fork differs from a dilemma, where two choices lead to different, undesirable outcomes, and the chooser must select the lesser evil, because in Morton's Fork, the outcomes are the same, are equally bad, and the choice is between different routes to that bad outcome. And this makes Morton's Fork particularly frustrating, particularly demoralizing, because at least in a dilemma there is a meaningful choice, a decision that matters, but in Morton's Fork the choice does not matter. The outcome is fixed, and the appearance of choice is a cruel illusion. The concept has applications in game theory, in situations where a player's strategies are dominated, where regardless of what the player does, the outcome is worse than some alternative the player cannot access, and recognizing Morton's Forks is important for strategic reasoning, for understanding when continued play is pointless, when the game should be abandoned rather than played, because playing only wastes resources without changing the outcome. Morton's fork also appears in legal and political contexts, where laws or policies are designed to be inescapable, where any action a person takes falls under the law's scope, and this can be legitimate, can reflect comprehensive regulation of a domain, but it can also be oppressive, can create situations where individuals have no legal way to avoid a burden, no option but compliance, and recognizing such structures is important for identifying injustice, for understanding when law has become a trap rather than a framework for freedom. The paradox also has psychological dimensions, because facing Morton's fork creates learned helplessness, creates the sense that choices do not matter, that outcomes are predetermined regardless of effort or strategy, and this can lead to resignation, to ceasing to resist, to accepting the inevitable, and oppressive systems often work by creating Morton's forks, by ensuring that resistance and compliance lead to similar outcomes, that fighting and surrendering are equally futile, and breaking out of Morton's fork requires either finding a hidden third option, a way to refuse the binary choice, or accepting one path and finding meaning in the choosing, even if the outcome is fixed. Some philosophers argue that life itself is Morton's fork, that all paths lead to death, that whether we live virtuously or wickedly, happily or miserably, we end up in the same place, non-existent, and this can be a source of nihilism, can undermine the sense that choices matter, but it can also be liberating, can free us to choose based on values rather than outcomes, to recognize that if all paths lead to death, then what matters is the path itself, the journey, not the destination, and Morton's fork becomes an invitation to find meaning in process rather than result. The Archbishop's strategy was effective, was brutal, extracted taxes efficiently, and the nobles paid, unable to escape the logic, unable to find a strategy that avoided the fork. And Morton's fork entered history, became a term of art, became a warning about inescapable traps, about situations where apparent choice conceals actual constraint, and the fork remains present in contemporary debates about policy, law, and strategy. A reminder that not all choices are meaningful, that sometimes the appearance of freedom masks the reality of compulsion, and that recognizing Morton's fork is the first step toward escaping it, toward finding the third option, the refusal to engage, the rejection of the binary. And the fork stands, points in two directions, both leading to the same place, and the challenge is to see the fork for what it is, to recognize when choice is illusory, when strategy is futile, and when the only real option is to walk away, to refuse the fork entirely, to create a new path that the fork's designer did not anticipate. And Morton's fork remains a timeless trap, a logical structure that appears whenever someone seeks to eliminate all escape routes, to ensure that whatever choice is made, the desired outcome follows, and the fork endures as a reminder that the appearance of choice can be deceptive, that freedom requires more than options, requires that options lead to genuinely different outcomes, and that when options converge, when the fork's prongs meet, choice becomes meaningless, and only opting out restores agency. Meinong's paradox, where non-existent objects live. A philosopher named Alexius Meinong proposes a strange theory, a theory about objects that do not exist, and Meinong argues that there are objects that do not exist, but still have properties, can be talked about, can be thought about, and these non-existent objects populate what Meinong calls the realm of being, a broader category than existence, and examples include the Golden Mountain, which does not exist but is golden and is a mountain, and the round square, which does not exist but is round and square, and Sherlock Holmes, who does not exist but is a detective and lives on Baker Street. And Meinong's theory says we can make true statements about these non-existent objects, can say truly that the Golden Mountain is golden, even though no Golden Mountain exists, and this creates paradoxes, creates puzzles about the nature of reference and truth. Because how can statements about nothing be true? How can non-existent objects have properties? How can we refer to what does not exist? And this is Meinong's paradox, the puzzle about non-existent objects, about whether they are real in some sense, whether being is broader than existence, whether there are things that do not exist but still have some kind of reality. And this paradox has generated enormous discussion, has led some philosophers to defend Meinong's theory in modified form and others to reject it entirely, to argue that non-existent objects are impossible, are contradictions, and all objects that can be thought about must exist in some sense. Imagine thinking about Sherlock Holmes, picturing the detective, his deerstalker hat, his pipe, his address at 221B Baker Street, and you're thinking about something. Your thoughts have content, have an object, and that object is Sherlock Holmes. But Sherlock Holmes does not exist, was never a real person, is a fictional character invented by Arthur Conan Doyle. And so, what are you thinking about when you think about Sherlock Holmes? What is the object of your thought? And Meinong says the object is Sherlock Holmes himself, a non-existent object, an object that has properties like being a detective and living on Baker Street but lacks the property of existence. And this seems to make sense of how we can think about fictional characters, how we can make true statements about them, but it creates problems because it seems to commit us to a vast ontology of non-existent objects. All the fictional characters, all the impossible objects like round squares, all the merely possible objects that could exist but do not. And this ontology seems bloated, seems to violate parsimony, seems to multiply entities beyond necessity. The paradox sharpens when we consider impossible objects, objects like the round square, which is both round and square, and these properties are incompatible, cannot both be instantiated by a single object. And yet Meinong's theory seems to allow that the round square is both round and square, has both properties despite their incompatibility, and this violates the law of non-contradiction, seems to allow contradictions to be true. And Russell famously criticized Meinong for this, argued that the round square both exists and does not exist. Exists because it has properties and things with properties must exist to have them, and does not exist because that is part of its characterization. And this contradiction shows that Meinong's theory is incoherent, cannot be accepted, and non-existent objects are impossible, and all talk of them must be reinterpreted as talk of something else, talk of ideas or words or possible worlds, but not talk of actual non-existent objects. Visualize Meinong's ontology as having two realms, the realm of existence containing actual objects, like tables and mountains and people, and the realm of being containing all objects, including non-existent ones like golden mountains and fictional characters, and the realm of being is vastly larger, contains everything we can conceive, all possibilities and impossibilities, and only a tiny subset of being also has existence. And Meinong's theory says that statements can be true of objects in the realm of being whether or not those objects exist, and truth is not restricted to existing objects. And this solves certain puzzles about reference, about how we can refer to what does not exist, but creates the paradox of how non-existent objects can have properties, can be subjects of true predications when there is nothing there to have the properties. One response to Meinong's paradox rejects non-existent objects, adopts Russell's theory of descriptions, which analyzes statements about non-existent objects as existential statements that happen to be false, and the golden mountain is golden becomes. There exists something that is golden and is a mountain, and this statement is false because no such thing exists. And fictional statements are understood as prefixed by an implicit fiction operator. In the Sherlock Holmes stories, it is true that Holmes is a detective, and this preserves the intuition that Holmes is a detective, in some sense, while avoiding commitment to non-existent objects. And this Russellian approach has been standard in analytic philosophy, is the orthodox view, treats apparent reference to non-existent objects as disguised quantification or as occurring within the scope of intentional operators. Another response defends Meinong's theory in modified form, accepts that there are non-existent objects, but restricts what properties they can have, distinguishes between nuclear properties like being golden or being a detective, which non-existent objects can have, and extra-nuclear properties like existing or being thought about, which are different, and impossible objects like round squares have both roundness and squareness as nuclear properties, but do not violate contradiction because they do not exist, do not have instances in reality, and their properties do not need to be jointly instantiable. And this neo-Meinongian approach preserves some of Meinong's insights while avoiding Russell's objection, and various philosophers, including Terence Parsons and Richard Routley, have developed sophisticated neo-Meinongian theories that handle the paradoxes. A third response appeals to possible worlds, argues that fictional and non-existent objects exist in other possible worlds, are possible but not actual, and when we talk about Sherlock Holmes, we're talking about a possible person, someone who exists in other possible worlds, in worlds where Conan Doyle's stories are true, and this preserves the intuition that Holmes is a detective, is a real object in some sense, while avoiding the paradox of non-existent objects, because Holmes is not non-existent but merely non-actual, exists in other worlds. And possible worlds semantics provides a framework for understanding modality and fiction without Meinongian ontology. Meinong's paradox also raises questions about what it means to exist, about whether existence is a property like others or is somehow special, and Kant argued that existence is not a real predicate, not a property that objects have or lack, but is the presupposition of having properties. And this Kantian view seems to refute Meinong, seems to show that non-existent objects cannot have properties because having properties requires existing. But Meinongians respond that this assumes existence is necessary for predication, that only existing things can have properties, and this assumption is precisely what Meinong denies. And the debate continues about whether existence is a property and whether objects must exist to have properties. The golden mountain glitters in imagination, non-existent but golden, and Sherlock Holmes solves cases in fiction, non-existent but a detective, and the round square defies logic, non-existent and impossible, and Meinong's theory says these are real objects in the broad sense of being, and the paradox asks how this can be, how nothing can be something, how non-existence can have properties, and the answers divide philosophers, some accepting Meinong's insights, some rejecting them entirely, and the paradox persists as a challenge to theories of reference and ontology, a puzzle about what we talk about when we talk about what does not exist, and whether such talk requires real objects or can be explained without them. And Meinong's paradox endures as one of the strangest and most controversial problems in metaphysics, a problem about the boundary between being and non-being, about what counts as real, and about whether existence is the only kind of reality or whether non-existent objects have their own shadowy realm of being. Parfit's teletransportation paradox. Imagine a future where technology allows instant travel across vast distances through a process called teletransportation. A device scans your body down to the atomic level, recording the exact position and state of every particle, and then transmits this information to a distant location where another device reconstructs you perfectly, assembling a body atom by atom according to the transmitted blueprint. And the reconstruction is flawless, every memory intact, every scar reproduced, every thought continued, and the reconstructed person steps out of the receiving chamber, believing themselves to be you, feeling no discontinuity, no sense that anything strange has occurred. The philosopher Derek Parfit asked a disturbing question about this process. Are you the person who steps out of the receiving chamber, or did you die in the scanning chamber? And a copy, a duplicate with all your memories and personality, is now living your life. And if the scanning process destroys the original body as it records the information, then perhaps it is still you, continuous in some sense, but what if the original body is not destroyed? What if the scanner leaves you standing in the departure chamber, intact and alive, while the reconstruction appears in the receiving chamber? And now there are two of you, both with equal claim to being the original, both feeling that they are you, and if both are you, then identity has become plural. But if only one is you, then which one and what criterion could possibly distinguish them when they are physically and psychologically identical? Parfit used this thought experiment to challenge the intuition that personal identity is what matters in survival, arguing that what matters is not identity, not being numerically the same person, but rather psychological continuity and connectedness, the preservation of memories, personality, beliefs, desires, and ongoing projects. And if these are preserved, then survival has occurred even if strict identity has not. And so, the reconstructed person is you in every way that matters, even if they are not numerically identical to the original you. And the question of whether identity is preserved is a question about what we care about rather than a deep metaphysical fact. The paradox becomes more troubling when variations are introduced. Suppose the teletransportation device malfunctions and creates not one, but two reconstructions, both perfect, both claiming to be you, and now identity must branch, which seems impossible because identity is supposed to be a one-to-one relation. A thing is identical only to itself, and yet both reconstructions have an equal claim. And if identity is not preserved in this case, then why should it be preserved in the normal case where only one reconstruction appears? And if it is not preserved, then every time you use the teletransporter, you die, and a new person with your memories takes your place, living a life they falsely believe is a continuation of yours. Parfit embraced the conclusion that identity is not what matters, that we should care about psychological continuity rather than numerical identity, and that the concept of a persisting self, a single unified person who endures over time, is less important than we ordinarily think. That what makes your future self matter to you now is not that they are literally the same person, but that they are psychologically connected to you in the right ways, and if those connections can branch or spread across multiple individuals, then so be it. Identity is not sacred, not the ultimate ground of value or concern. The teletransportation paradox has implications for how we think about personal survival, about whether what matters in death is the cessation of psychological continuity or the cessation of biological life, about whether uploading consciousness to a computer or creating digital copies would constitute survival or merely the creation of simulacra, and about whether the self is a metaphysical entity or a convenient fiction we use to organize experience. The paradox also challenges intuitions about moral responsibility, because if identity is vague or plural, then questions about who is responsible for past actions or who deserves future rewards become murky, and the unity of the person, which underpins much of ethics and law, begins to dissolve. Parfit's teletransportation scenario remains one of the most powerful thought experiments in philosophy, a story that uses imaginable technology to expose deep questions about identity, survival, and what it means to be a person, forcing recognition that the boundaries of the self, like the boundaries of clouds and cats, may be far less clear and far less important than common sense suggests, and that the question of whether you survive. Teletransportation may have no determinate answer, or many answers, or may simply be the wrong question to ask.